Fitness owners, this is Eric from the Fitness CPA. Man, what tough times we're in right now. Today's goal is to go over rent abatements with your landlords. One of our biggest expenses, one of our biggest pain points. It's on everybody's mind. At the time of this recording, it's the 22nd of March. This will probably get published on the 23rd, which means, we have just 7 days until that April rent is due. So when I go through this is not going to be a short presentation. Certainly not all of these items will be applicable to you in your situation, but I'm hoping that there's some little nuggets in here that will help you through these negotiations, that will help you and your landlord reach a win-win and potentially get you out of a full or even more than one full month's worth of rent. And we'll go through those strategies here. We do have some additional resources available for download, including that script for the initial abatement request, and then we have some scripts for the second abatement request and really where we land when we meet halfway or in a compromise with someone. But I think first, we're kind of aiming for the stars here and aiming to have a full month's of rent abated. That means never paid back. We want it for free, at least initially, but there's a certain way to go about that, and there's certain ways not to go about that. So let's jump in. This is our second in our probably many-part series of the COVID-19 series, Rent Abatement for Fitness Studios. Rent, as we kind of covered at the top of the call here, is your biggest expense. It's equal to 1/3 of your annual revenues, and that's why we're concerned. If you have to pay rent and you're not selling anything, you don't have revenues coming in, or if you've moved virtual, you have fewer revenues coming in, you're going to have a really difficult time making that large rent payment each month. But, hope is not a strategy. Action will be rewarded in this. That famous Vince Lombardi quote, David Baker put a little spin on it today. And, those who are taking action during this time period are the ones who are going to succeed and come out the other side of this. People who are sitting on the sidelines, saying, woe is me, and maybe somebody can give me a handout. It's not going to work in this time. So we have two predictions here. First, that studios that are moving to virtual options, we believe that your revenues are probably going to drop by as much as 30 to 50% during this COVID-19 shutdown or closure. Again, if you've seen our earlier video, we're recommending you close, but we're seeing closures, we're projecting closures are going to go for a minimum of 8 weeks at this time period. And when we look at our average client base, the number of folks who have drop-ins and punch cards, and those are much harder to sell through those virtual options, we do expect to see that 30 to 50% drop in revenues. Now, studios without virtual options, their revenues are going to drop by at least 50%. And we don't recommend the latter, but if you're not offering something to your clients, if you don't have optional training, ways to meet with trainers, ways to offer classes online, your revenues are going to drop. And they may not right now, as of the time of this recording, but over time, we have to admit that members are going to become less willing to contribute and to keep you afloat during these times. So let's set the stage and kind of talk about what we need to kind of think about here. First is, are you open? If you see my eyes shifting back and forth, I've got tons of notes here to go along with this slide deck today. And so apologies, can't keep my eyes on the camera the whole time. But if you're open, we recommend closing. But if you insist on staying open, your rent abatement is not going to be in the cards. If a landlord sees you open, knows you're open, and if your state hasn't mandated that you close, then it's going to be a little bit harder to get abatement during this time period. If you have closed or you're moving to virtual, can your business still afford to pay rent during this virtual environment? 1 month, okay, should be able to make that. I think most businesses should, but what if this goes 3 months, 4 months, 6 months? What if we see a resurfacing of this in the wintertime? We need to be thinking about that virtual platform. Can you pay rent, right? For a lot of folks, they can afford to pay it. And so if you can't afford to pay it, I would ask you, do you really need a rent abatement? Do you need to get the whole month for free? Can you really meet halfway with the landlord, or can you just pay your rent and move forward and say, look, these are tough times. I'm contractually obligated to pay my rent, and so I'm going to pay it. But I think financial ability comes into play. And even if the business does not have the money that it needs to pay the rent, do you personally have the money, or do your partners have money that you can put in so that you can afford to pay the rent? And do you want to reopen? This is a question a lot of fitness business owners are unfortunately struggling with during this time period. This could be a chance to close the business. And we're seeing, we have two examples in our portfolio right now of clients who were very much on the brink of closing before, and the prospects of trying to rebuild that membership base on the end of this, really kind of begs the question is, do they want to throw another, in these particular instances, $10,000 to $12,000 at monthly rent and reopen, or, during this time period, and then potentially not reopen anyways? I think that's a huge question right now for a good segment of our fitness businesses who are living, week to week, or were living week to week on their money beforehand. And now during this, it becomes nearly impossible. And so I think you need to look long and hard, talk to your loved ones, your significant others, talk to your team, and think about, do you really want to reopen after this is done? And, it's a hard question. Nobody can answer that for you, but this could be an opportunity. A lot of times when we look at folks who have closed businesses, gone through bankruptcy, been terminated for jobs, finally quit the job that they were having trouble with, left a bad relationship, a lot of times there's a huge sense of relief. I mean, an overwhelming sense of relief. And we never want someone to stay in our industry. It's hard as is if they're not prepared for the long haul and they don't have their hearts in it. And sometimes we have to admit to ourselves that maybe your heart isn't in it anymore. And now is the time to look at the opportunity for closing, whatever that may mean. I promise you, for all of my clients who have closed in the past, or clients who have closed and then consulted with us on that closing or the aftermath of, in virtually every instance, they have been relieved and it's been a good decision. They've been happy to have made that decision. So something to think about. I want to remind, the biggest thing to think about here is that you do have a legal obligation to pay rent. I spoke with Brandon Hall, the real estate CPA, who has a very wide network of landlords as the real estate CPA. And, he just wanted to remind us that, tenants still have an obligation to pay rent. Absent otherwise, you do have this legal obligation. And it's important that despite all of the workarounds, ideas, meeting halfways, the concepts that I present today, that you still have that legal obligation until something else is in writing. The sentiment, Brandon says, among landlords right now is that tenants must still pay rent. And I'm not going to disagree with that. You'll see me agree, but I have a spin on it. But landlords are willing to work with tenants who are solution oriented. And that's where we're going to land on this. Tenants who work with their landlords are going to find a solution, and we may have an abatement period, we may have a deferral period, we may have some options, but at this time where it is, again, March 22nd, I think things will be developing over the coming weeks, and as the societal pressures mount, we're going to see more pressure on landlords to come up with more favorable agreements. This should say stiff. I'm not going to fix this typo or re-record this. This is what happens when you work on the fly. This should say if tenants try to stiff landlords, it's going to be a battle. So, stiffing someone obviously means ignoring them, not paying rent when you're supposed to, not communicating, and just thinking that you're entitled not to pay rent. We certainly don't want to take that approach. And if tenants are proactive in discussing options, landlords are more than willing to work with them for a win-win. And that's just clear, and that's what we're going to try to go through line by line in this presentation today. So read your lease. Let's talk about reading your lease and looking through it and looking for ways that this could potentially be resolved from a lease perspective. Do you have force majeure in place? Force majeure, and again, I'm seeing a small typo there, but is a clause that generally describes the circumstances outside a party's control that may not be enforceable unless conditions at issue relate to those specifically enumerated in the clause. In our blog post, we'll have examples of the force majeure quote in an example of it from a lease, but examples include something like a strike. It includes government shutdown. It does include even things like pandemics and epidemics and disease and outbreak. Force majeure clauses are not common in leases, but they're not uncommon either. In a quick survey of some of our clients and a few of our colleagues' clients, we found that about 1 in 4 had a force majeure clause in their lease agreement. It is something worth looking into. Review your lease. accountants can review leases, not from a legal perspective, but we can point this out if you need some help. If you're one of our clients, definitely reach out. We can look for it in the lease for you, or look for language that may be similar. Of course, your attorney is going to be the best person to go to look at the legal ins and outs of this. The force majeure may be an opportunity where you can even break the lease and get out of it entirely, which would be a potential win for certain individuals who are looking to get out of their lease agreement. We're predicting that insurance, such as business interruption insurance, will not help, and we're seeing that pretty much across the board here. A pandemic caused by a virus is typically not covered by business interruption insurance. It's more for fires and natural disasters. And people are kind of looking to ways to manipulate their contract or look at ideas. And I think even when we go back to force majeure, there's some debate among attorneys, which is always a headache when I think about this. Attorneys are always challenging to talk to, and they say, well, in the court of law and this and that, and we always want black and white answers, but that's not true when it comes to legal work. But what we're also seeing in force majeure is that if a pandemic or epidemic isn't specifically listed, it may be excluded. Or the flip side of that is if you have a general force majeure clause that says, or other acts, it's possible that we could have pandemic be an applicable item in that clause. But a lot of this is going to play out over the coming weeks on a case-by-case basis between tenants and landlords. And we've got, again, about 7 days until rent payments will be due. And so it's important that you take action now, and then more than likely needing to take that action once again right before that rent payment is due. Last item under read your lease is, are you willing to go to court? And courts are going to have an inevitable lag time. They're already backed up. A lot of courts are out of session or taking minimal sessions. And so are you willing? Court can be expensive, costly, headaches. I've never met anyone from a business perspective who was glad they went to court. Personally, I believe that by the time you get attorneys involved, everybody loses. And, it's just going to be very painful. But I think you have to ask yourself, if you're talking to an attorney and you're talking about battling with a landlord or pointing out things, the nitty gritty in a lease, we have to be willing to go to court to prove these at the end of the day. You do have, I just want to remind you, in almost every instance, a personal guarantee. We did have one client in our portfolio who doesn't have a personal guarantee on their lease. That was an oversight on the landlord's part. But bankruptcy is an option. You can negotiate out of a lease so that you don't have to file bankruptcy. Classic scenarios to get out of a lease would be, paying 1 full year's worth of rent. It would be paying, getting a loan where you're going to pay them back over time. It would be finding a tenant. I think landlords are going to be very hesitant to negotiate someone out of a lease at this time period because they're worried about that space being empty later, but it's always possible. You don't necessarily have to file bankruptcy, but bankruptcy definitely is an exit strategy to get out of a lease agreement. And maybe an ultimate one for a lot of fitness business owners. Definitely speak with your fitness CPA or your attorney and talk to them further. And as a matter of fact, if you're going to talk to an attorney, make sure you talk to your CPA as well. Those conversations shouldn't happen without the other party being involved. So let's lay the framework for the landlord and the tenant relationship. Most landlords are human like us. I say most kind of tongue in cheek. There's certainly some of them that we maybe don't feel are like humans, but they are. And we want to definitely remind you that to falsely think that landlords are bad is just inaccurate. And landlords really despise this. They don't like feeling like they're overlords because they're just like me and you. They're running a real estate business and they're trying to scrape by a little bit of profit. Some do better than others, but most of them have worked very, very hard to build their wealth and have made sacrifices along the way, a lot like you have as a business owner. And so I think we need to empathize with what they have going on as well. They have obligations and payments that they have to make. I even heard of a group in North Carolina that's kind of doing this gathering of an April rent strike, and their tagline is, "We've lost our jobs, so we shouldn't have to pay rent." And people over profits. But what they don't realize is that this is an awful way to deal with a situation, and they're asking for something. They're asking for compassion without being willing to give any themselves. And we certainly have to put ourselves in the landlord's shoes, which we'll do in a minute here. But let's talk about this relationship between you and the landlord, because a lot of folks forget that the landlords and tenants, they're in partnership together. People forget this. The landlords are highly invested in your success. They want you to be and stay in that lease for a long time. And, they don't want to go out and get someone else. I think when we think about kind of the classic example, a lot of us have had or have been residential renters at some point, or have residential leases ourselves or rental properties ourselves. And when you find a good tenant, you want to hold on to them. They don't cause damage to the property. They don't have complaints. They don't break things. They mow the lawn on time. They maybe did an improvement to the property. A good tenant is worth a lot of money, both actual money and in intangible benefits. And landlords, if you've been a good tenant, they're in partnership with you. They want to keep you in the space. They want to make this work as well. And so with that being said, we need to approach the landlord with the spirit of being forthright and open in partnership. I personally believe that this is more common than not in the fitness industry. I think our fitness owners are very collaborative, they're entrepreneurial, and they're willing to approach things in this forthright and partnership way. And so treating your landlord with partnership and a sense of mutual interest, it's going to make it harder for them to say no. When you really talk to someone about what's going on and a long-term solution and a win-win, they're going to be in a tough spot where they're not going to want to just blanket say no. They're going to want to work with you on things. And so, how comfortable you are at being smart and asking about this, in an email and on the phone, versus, creating bad will by renegotiating the entire lease and asking for 90 days off. And so we're going to talk about how to go about this, and we're going to have resources available for download at the bottom of this blog post. And if you, I guess below in this video as well, we'll link to it. But, you don't want to go in and say, hey, I want 90 days free rent. You're never going to get that in this climate right now. But can you be smart? If you're comfortable and can you have that conversation, you're going to get a little bit more. As we stated earlier, nobody benefits if this gets legal. This, in our opinion, is an option of last resort, and everybody loses when it gets legal. You don't want to make this ugly. So most banks and landlords don't want to clear out all the tenants, and they would rather strike a deal. That being said, we all know very stubborn people who would be stubborn to their own detriment. That may be your landlord. We hope not, especially given the set of circumstances we're dealing with, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt. And even the stubborn landlord, I think that there's going to be a lot of room here. Let's wear your landlord's shoes. Let's put them on for a day. What do you know about your landlord? If you don't know anything about your landlord, ask your original broker. They probably have a sense of some of the facts that we're going to talk about here. They're a really great place to start. And is the landlord a large landlord? Do they have a large percentage of retail properties in your city? A lot of them tend to own several properties, or are they a single unit building owner? Some folks barely scrape together the money. They beg, borrow, and steal in order to, get that single building and own it. And they may not be as big as you think. I think when you think about your business, we have to put ourselves, when our fitness members look at us, a lot of times they look at our business. We have a brick and mortar location. We have a team in place. We have branding. We've been in the community for a while. They go, you're doing so good. You can afford to, you don't need our money, or why can't you give us this for free? And we know that we barely scrape by in the fitness industry. And so the same thing would go for landlords as well. It definitely can be the circumstance. What does the landlord own, and how are their assets diversified? If they have other real estate, if they have other properties, if they are pretty wealthy, it can weigh a little bit more in your favor. How's the center doing overall? How much empty space is there? We have centers who have been on wait list for 2 years to get tenants in, and as soon as a tenant leaves, they get a new one in. They have tenants willing to pay above market rates, and we have other spaces where there's many open locations, can have a 50% vacancy rate. These are contrasting scenarios. And then through the COVID-19 crisis, are you having closures? Is a good segment of your business in that center service base so that they are closing, and they do have the landlords are aware of the plight of that area? I think it's definitely conflicting onto how this affects your negotiations. If the center is doing well overall, we might think that would be an area for them to give us more abatement or give us more leeway. However, that might mean that the landlord is going to be bullish and feel that they can fill the space. And if you want to leave, then you leave. And they might be able to fill the space without a problem. When we think about empty spaces, a lot of us think that, well, it's empty and the landlord doesn't have a case against us. Certainly they don't want to push us out because they're already 50% empty. They don't want to go 40, 60% empty and have more empty people there. But that may not necessarily be the case. If the landlord only has a few tenants, they may need your money in order to pay their debt obligations. They may be under tighter financial constraints than you would believe because of the empty space. And so each of these items have pros and cons to them. Are other businesses open? We talked about this just briefly, but restaurants are open for takeaway. Are other service-based businesses there? Hair salons, nails, massage clinics, other fitness centers, are they closed? And, can we look to them for examples of what's happening in your center? Landlords definitely have been on the phone with their attorneys. They're not the only ones losing sleep over this. They've been nonstop trying to figure out ways to look out for their own interest, because in almost every instance, they're going to owe money to the bank. Landlords certainly have already begun conversations about restructuring debt with their lenders or about getting flexible payment options for themselves, but they haven't likely landed on an option yet. And, even Brandon from, the real estate CPA says, we're not really sure how this is going to play out. We're really not sure whether there's going to be interest that accrues, whether there's going to be interest forgiven by the federal government through those loans. If they're private loans, as is in the case in a lot of commercial lending, the lenders are not likely to abate interest or to give the landlord interest for free. And so therefore, they're going to be under tighter financial constraints to collect rents during this downtime. And without a doubt, very, very few landlords are going to give blanket rent abatements to blocks of tenants at their centers. They're not just going to say, hey, you guys don't have to pay rent. Don't worry about it. All of you guys are in the clear. Don't pay us tenants. We're okay, landlords. This comes from Greg Glass of Gibbons White. He's a real estate broker trusted here in the state of Colorado who, just has a good sense of the landlord marketplace, and couldn't agree with him more. What were the market conditions before COVID-19? Were people in demand for the space? Was the space in demand? Was it hard to get in there? Were market rates high? Or was it the contrary? Were there empty spaces? And this is something that we touched about earlier, but in stark contrast to how they were before, what are the conditions afterwards? What are we thinking for what happens after COVID-19? Are we going to see a lot of closures? Are we going to see available spaces? Is the market going to really need tenants to come back in? And if that's the case, then your landlord should be more willing to work with you. And I think this is clear as we've talked through this, but the status of the real estate market absolutely affects the strength of the tenant's bargaining position. So if the market is stronger, you have less of a position to bargain from. If the market is weaker, then you have a much stronger position to bargain from and strike a deal with the landlord. Questions to ask yourself about the landlord relationship. Megan Allen of Fran Promise has consulted with hundreds of franchisees in rent abatement, rent negotiations, obtaining leases, letters of intent, and if you don't know the answers to the questions that we're going to talk about here, there's a much bigger problem here. And let's go through it so that you can understand really what she's talking about. How was the original negotiation process? What happened with that LOI? What happened when you signed the lease? What happened when there was a last minute change, when there was an unforeseen circumstance? How were both sides negotiating? Were you very stubborn? Did you lash out? Did you put your foot down and, did you stomp your feet and try to get your way? Or did you try to reach out for a win-win? On the flip side, how was your landlord? Did they stomp their feet? Did they put up a fuss and not want to meet halfway when inevitably with a lot of these constructions are built out of LOIs that there's some conflicting item? Often when we have an LOI, the terms in the lease are a little bit clearer and that changes each side. They go, oh, well, we didn't talk about that, or that's not exactly how I interpreted it. And it's important that those negotiations that we kind of figure out, how is that relationship? So was it high conflict? Was it smooth back and forth? Did you feel that the landlord did a fair job? And also for yourself, did you feel that you were fair? Were you able to get where you needed mutually? And that's what we're going to attempt to do here with these rent abatement negotiations, is try to get somewhere mutually between yourselves. When did your lease start? How long have you been there? Are you due up for renewal soon? Is your lease going to be over in 6 months? Have you been in there for 6 months? Where are you? This is definitely a great context for the length of this relationship. Just like any relationship, the longer that you're in it, the more weight it can carry. But as a relationship nears the end of its term, say if you're at the end of your lease term, it may be an okay time to separate when you talk to the landlord and get an understanding. I have clients right now who are within about 12 months of the end of their lease term, and they're considering closing through the COVID-19 outbreak. And I think logically we're looking at the landlord and we're trying to think of a reasonable way to meet halfway, because we don't want to pay rent for the remaining 12 or 14 months that this lease period is. But they are so close to the end of their lease term and they did not want to renew. They intended to close their business. And so I think logically they're going, gosh, why rebuild and try to do this? Can we negotiate with the landlord, because there is only 12 or 14 months left on our lease? How many times have you asked for help? How many times have you reached out to the landlord and said, fix this, do that. I need more HVAC allowance. I need repairs. We have water damage. We need more parking spaces. What has that been in the past? Have you been needy, or have you tried to fix things on your own? And overall relationship, do you see do you see the landlord or its representatives on a regular basis? And do you have a personal rapport? It's a bit late now, but just like any relationship, we need to reach out to folks, stay in touch with them, come at it from a genuine place of concern. Hey, how are you? Good to see you. How are things going? How's the family? And, we don't build those relationships overnight, and we're certainly not going to be building them now during this time period, but, thinking about where you stand on this from your prior actions and the landlord's prior actions. And then additionally, how do you change this going forward? How do we build those relationships with folks? Do you just stop by the rental office and say hi and smile to people? Do you send them a Christmas card? What does it mean when you think about building relationship? If you're building relationship with your members and your other vendors, then you certainly need to be building relationship with your landlord, because these are the people that, as a reminder, they're in partnership with you. Absolutely. So who's the decision maker? Do you deal with just a property manager? Do you talk to the actual landlord themselves, the building owner, their representative, or do they hire a third party to come in? We do have situations where a property manager may not have the ability to help you, or they're not an authorized agent. They might truly have to go up the chain before they can approve something. You might get along with Joe, and Joe may come by and help out all the time, but his hands may be tied when it comes to agreeing on rent abatement or deferral or some type of favorable situation. And so do you have a sense, and maybe this item kind of belonged up earlier, but do you have a sense of the cost of the items that the landlord has put in during your tenure? And this is especially important when we think about tenant improvement funds. So let's take the smaller topic first. If you had damage, if your lease was up for renewal and you needed a new coat of paint, if you needed extermination, if you needed, any repairs and maintenance, was the landlord putting money into your place, and did he do it with a smile? Was he happy to, make an investment into your space, or did he put nothing in there? And then to grow that item a little bit more, we talk about tenant improvement funds. These are the funds typically at the top of a lease term, the original lease, or at a lease renewal where you say, hey, look, I'm willing to stay here. I'm committed to 5, 7, 10 years or more. But at the same time, I need money for build out. I need money for utilities to be brought into the unit. I need money for HVAC. I need money for refurbishing or demolishing the existing space that's in there. And when we think about landlords, a lot of them, they borrow on money to provide those tenant improvement funds. I know many spaces in our network, clients that we work with, who have received over $300,000 of tenant improvement funds from their landlord. Now we've certainly seen less. We've seen 100,000, we've seen 50,000, I've seen 20,000. But generally in a new lease, the landlord is making an investment into you. And so we do need to think about those clauses in there that say if you do exit the lease early, that you have to pay back those tenant improvement funds. It certainly is going to come into play and be a huge factor in here. So just to state it more clearly, the landlord who has given you $300,000 to build out the space is going to be much less excited about abating or giving you any type of free rent at all. The landlord who maybe gave you $5,000, $20,000 and the space needed to be fixed up anyways, they would be perhaps more willing to provide some abatement during this difficult time period. And these cases aren't black and white, but they're factors that come into play here. Have you made any past due payments without notifying the landlord? This is, one of the worst things that we can do as a tenant that can put a real black mark on our profile and our relationship with our landlord. We don't want to be that historically either even late once or late multiple times where you're always having the landlord to beg for you and they're showing up at your place and they're saying, hey, where's the rent check? It was due. These are the folks who more than likely aren't going to get abatement, or are going to have a really hard time getting abatement. If they do get any type of agreement or meeting compromise from the landlord, it's usually going to come with very strict stipulations, as we would imagine it would. And how many major expenses has the landlord paid for that you didn't have to? This kind of goes to the repairs and maintenance, but if the HVAC unit broke, did they come and fix it and not put it on your bill? Did anything need to happen? Did the parking lot need to be refurbished, resealed, replaced? And did the landlord take care of it that you didn't have to? These are, again, the more that they've invested in a property that you haven't, the less likely they're going to be willing to help you through things. The initial ask. We're going to have a huge resource on this. It's linked to below this video if you're watching this on YouTube. It's in the blog post, at the bottom of the blog post. Please get our resource on the initial ask. There's going to be a ton of help in here. In case your sarcasm isn't up to snuff, one of our options on the initial ask is a joke. Please don't take it seriously. It's meant to add some levity to the handout, but they're essentially two examples of how you might ask, and then the third example of how not to ask for rent abatement. We believe there's going to be a very valuable resource, and then we'll have a secondary resource included as well for how to ask the second time, what we would call the secondary ask, and what that compromise would look like, and options for how to structure that compromise. So who are you going to ask? If it's that large faceless landlord, lean on the people there. This is information that we're receiving from Greg Glass, that real estate broker that's trusted in my network. Who do you know? Who do you work with? And you're going to contact those people. It's built on that relationship. And because it's that relationship, we're going to do a personal appeal, both by phone or in person, and written. So let me just rephrase this. You have to do it in writing. So you're going to follow up in writing, but you're going to ask to do it over the phone or in person. You're not just going to jot an email out that says, hey, I need free rent. You're not just going to, type somebody a text that says I need free rent. You're going to ask for a conversation. You're going to try to sit down. So let's leverage that relationship that you currently have rather than reaching out to the administrative office or talking to people that you don't know. And always want to be showing everything you're doing in other areas. Are other people helping you? Are you trying to cut other expenses? Are you looking for loans? What else are you doing on your side other than just asking the landlord? The landlord does not want to be the only one giving. I've seen this time and time again in rent abatements. They don't want to be the only person that, and this frequently happens for landlords, where people say, hey, look, I can't pay rent, but it turns out that they're paying, item A, B, C, D, E, and, G. And unfortunately, the landlord is always the one that people go to for relief. And the landlord says, look, I want to make this a partnership, but I don't want to be the only one giving in this relationship. And I could not understand that more. I think that's a really great point for landlords, to lean on whenever, if a landlord is watching this, or, you have a tenant, even a residential tenant. If people ever come to you for relief saying, who else is helping you during this time period? Because I'm not going to be the only one to give. This is a great one. Ask in a direct way. So the tenant's ability to communicate is key. And that's why we created the downloadable templates. Our templates are a script for how to ask on the phone and how to ask in writing. But you need to be a little bit direct. You cannot be wishy-washy and just get on the phone and complain or write an email that says, gosh, money's tight this month. We're not sure how we're going to make it. 30 days. 30 days is what we need to ask for at this point. We're getting close to April at the time of this recording, April 1. You do not want to ask for more than 30 days rent. Did speak with Greg, and some of the tenants that are reaching out to his landlords are asking for 90 days free rent. We don't know where this thing is going to be after 90 days. That will really harm your relationship with the landlord to ask for anything more than 30 days at this point. It's an evolving situation, very fluid day to day, however you want to phrase it, and 30 days for this upcoming April is really the maximum that should be asked for right now. Anything more than that is unreasonable, absolutely unreasonable, and will tarnish your relationship and ability to reach a compromise that's a win-win from both sides. One of the direct ways that our phrasing would be, these are extraordinary times, our business is shut down, and like the rest of the country, we could use relief. If you like that expression or something more expanded upon it, it'll be in the template that we're providing. When I say 30 days of rent abatement, I want to be clear that abatement is completely free rent that does not need to be paid back. So abatement is not something you're going to have to pay back at all. When we talk about other terms, deferral means paid later. Moratorium means let's just pause and wait. You may owe it, you may not. We're going to reach an agreement later. Let's talk about the don'ts. Don't show all your cards. I honestly believe in any negotiation, strategizing is really important, and we want to leave some gunpowder dry. We want to be able to reach back in our cards and play another card later, and we certainly don't want to become overly emotional. So, hold back a little bit, approach it. We've got, if you're watching this timely, you've got 7 days. You're going to reach out now, and then you're going to reach out again next week, right before the rent payment is due. So you're going to have 2 opportunities where you can up the ante a little bit. You can bring more of your cards. You don't want to show them that, for example, you have no money in your bank account, that you have no members. We don't want to necessarily open up with all of the details on our first opening ask. Certainly keep the emotions to a minimum. I think that's pretty obvious, but it's not unheard of to have people, crying and weeping on the phone, or yelling and angry, or distraught and unable to form sentences. And so, keeping the emotions out of it, definitely a must. This is your accountant speaking. Do not send financials unless the landlord requires them. There are a lot of reasons. We're working on a resource that probably won't be available for a few weeks about how to send financials to third parties, and a lot of reasons that we don't send financials to third parties. Definitely speak with your CPA, but if the landlord requires them, we're going to send them. Whatever the landlord needs, we can send it, but we're not going to send them unless they've asked. It can put you in a really bad position to send those. I would not mention limited revenue streams if you still have them. So if you've gone virtual, you're doing some remote training, you have some revenue coming in, people haven't canceled their memberships, don't say that. Don't say, hey, we're down at 50% memberships. We've got $30,000 coming in a month. The landlord is going to say, well, okay, well, give us that $30,000 because you signed a legal obligation to pay rent, and you have money coming in, and you need to pay it. We want to lean on things such as the government has forced us to close, our business is shut down, we're not able to offer our product, we're not able to do in-person training, and we want to definitely weave through these things and kind of navigate through. It can be unique what you say and what you don't say. We talked about this before. We're not asking for more than 30 days, but you do want to leave it open-ended. So one of the things would be, what are you structuring at this time? Asking the landlord what they're open to could be very important. If the landlord says 90 days instead of 30, always say, yes, this generally sounds good. Please email me what you're thinking of so we have a record of it. What we're really trying to say here is that the landlord may be in a position where they don't want to renegotiate this. It can be administratively heavy for them to talk about this every 30 days. And so by not putting them in a position where you're asking for a specific number of days, by asking, what are you structuring? You're allowing them to say, hey, we're doing 60 days for a lot of our clients who are completely shut down. Oh my goodness, let's start singing, praise the Lord, 60 days, this is beautiful. I could not be happier for that. Obviously you want to keep your cool, but there's a high possibility, let me rephrase that. There is a possibility that landlords will have a more generous offer depending on the situation that they're in. Okay, the initial landlord rejection. I'm probably going to say 8 or 9 times out of 10, you're probably going to get rejected when you request a full month of abatement. And we need to be prepared for this. You may get rejected right on that call, but let's remember it's a dance. So in our firm script, we have ways to respond to each of these, but did you get a firm no, as in a no, this isn't happening? Or did the landlord request more information? Or do you need more time? Did they just request more info? Can you get it to them? And can you get it to them fast? And can you make a decision before next month's rent is due? Do you have the right person? A lot like calling customer service, right? Can I speak with your supervisor? Obviously in a lot more of a respectful way. I know when I'm on with customer service, you can kind of be condescending, let me speak with your supervisor. In this instance, it's, hey, John, I really appreciate everything you've done. And, I know you're the property manager. Is there someone else that I could, plead my case to? Is there someone else who, I could have a meeting with and really talk to them about how difficult things are right now, and asking them if there's another decision maker up above them, but in the nicest damn way possible, because you definitely don't want to spoil that relationship with the individual you do have the rapport with. It's an evolving situation. So, what has changed since the last time you've asked? If you've asked already and you didn't have this presentation before, you didn't have these ideas, you didn't have our script, what has changed in the last couple of weeks? Has there been a new closure? Have other tenants closed? Has your landlord been able to get their loan payments abated? You wouldn't know that necessarily, but the situation's changing. So be patient, work together, and we believe that some type of relief is appropriate for businesses who have been affected like this, service businesses, fitness businesses, just like yours. The secondary ask. You're going to ask another time, and you're going to ask, hopefully, if you're watching this timely, Monday or Tuesday, right before the top of April. I'm just pulling up a quick calendar here to show you guys, right here, we're 22nd, 23rd. You're going to ask this week, the 23rd through the 27th, and then you're going to ask again, preferably on the 30th. If you do get pushed to the 31st, that's okay. Do take a look at your lease. You may have a grace period in there of 5 days. So you might technically have more days than the first. You might have out till the 6th to make a decision. But I wouldn't necessarily want to use that grace period if the landlord didn't want me to. I'd want to try to solve it sooner. And if you're watching this after the fact and you have your own situation, you can apply your timing and how that looks. But essentially trying to do the initial ask at least a week before the end of the month, and then doing the secondary ask right before the rent payment is due. And so as earlier, we talked about working your way up the chain of command if possible, but not always necessary. And requesting that meeting in person. That in-person meeting can be highly, highly valuable, where you're going to be able to have that contact. You're going to be able to show them the look in your eyes about how sincere and genuine and how hurt you are during this time period. And a reminder, you're also going to follow up in writing. We'll have scripts for that follow-up in writing as well. The secondary ask is going to be very situation dependent and very nuanced. And so our script for that is going to be some general guidelines. It's going to be harder to put something very specific like we did with our initial ask script, but do need to follow up in writing. On the secondary ask, you're going to send proof of the mandatory closure from your state, your governor, your franchisee, whoever mandated that you closed. If it wasn't you, if you did it voluntarily, you don't have that option, but we want to send them proof. If requested, we want to send them the, anything that demonstrates that the money isn't there through financials or bank statements. Sending a very particular formatted set of financials is important. Work with your Fitness CPA to get that set of financials that's going to paint you in the light, the best light to get abatement. We don't want to show cash heavy. We don't want to show strong profits. And we have the ability to, instead of sending the landlord, our January through February where things were really strong, we can send them the 2019 financials and say, look, the year on the whole wasn't that great. Don't show them that you kicked butt in January and February, as just one example. We do want to demonstrate potentially loss of members or revenue if they request it. We want to be basically prepared to provide anything the landlord asks for. If they ask you to jump through a hoop, say yes. If they ask you to jump, say how high. and be prepared to meet halfway. I want to really pause on this. We talk about abatement, and in the script it talks about, our first open is going to be looking for that 30-day free rent. But in the majority of circumstances, we have to acknowledge that we're more likely going to be meeting halfway. And so let's talk about a few of those options. A moratorium. A moratorium is just going to be a standstill. It says, hey, let's just wait and see where this goes. This is an evolving situation. A moratorium says, this is going to change. We're not going to take your rent from you right now. You're not going to be in default of the lease. Let's give this 2 weeks to breathe. Let's give this 30 weeks to breathe and then revisit, because it may be bad for you or the landlord to negotiate something for 30 days when we actually need something for 3 months. They don't want to give you free rent if they know this is going to be 3 months long that you're expecting free rent. A moratorium could be a wonderful, wonderful solution for a lot of folks in the situation where you don't have to have the landlord do anything, but you don't have to pay rent unnecessarily. I really like the moratorium idea for a lot of folks. Looks like 2 ideas came up here at once, but let's talk about the deferral to 2021 or the end of the lease term. Deferral means you're going to owe it, but you're going to pay it later. And so, look, we're getting to be probably halfway through 2020 when this coronavirus is passed. Hard to say exactly when, but if I'm in your shoes, I'm thinking about the eventual buildup that I'm going to have to redo of my members. I know that when I look at fitness businesses, it's going to take a while to come back after this. And so if I'm getting my rent deferred, I'm adding it to the 2021 payments. I'm not going to take my March and April and May payments and say, oh yeah, I'll pay them back in June, July, and August. We'll do double rent for 3 months in a row. There's no way you're going to be able to afford that. It's very unlikely you're going to be able to afford that. And so if you're working on a deferral, you want it added to 2021. So just a quick example is if we have a 1 month deferral, you don't pay your March rent. Your March rent is $12,000. You're going to take $12,000 and you're going to spread it out across 2021 so that every month in 2021, you're going to pay $12,000 more over the course of the year. So assuming your rent stays the same, which would be unlikely to, your January rent for 2021 would be $13,000 instead of $12,000. February would be $13,000 instead of $12,000. And that's a way to spread the cost out over time. Deferral could be a very good option where the landlord's going to get what they want. And we've got to think about deferral here. If somebody gave you a ton of money for the build out, man, they're not going to want to abate. They might abate 1 month, but you get into 2-3 months, you're talking about a deferral situations where you're going to be meeting for most of these people. You do have the option to add the deferred period to the end of the lease. There are people who are taking that money and they're saying, look, I'll pay you at the end of the lease term. That's a far off way to look at it, but it has worked. Landlords probably less willing to do that, but certainly an option. And then the next option that we have here would be using a security deposit. This is an idea that Brandon Hall from the Real Estate CPA said a few of his landlords are successfully using, and that's if that security deposit is sitting there in the bank account, saying, hey, I can't pay rent this month. Can we use the security deposit as an option for 30 days? Now, that means you won't have a security deposit there in the bank account for damages for when you leave the lease. And so it's possible you may need to pay this back. It's a little bit unclear to me. I think it's on a case-by-case basis what the landlord expects, whether they're going to recoup that security deposit for you, just like they would a deferral. But this is a wonderful option where the landlord can keep that cash. They can allocate it to their expenses, and then you don't have to pay that month's rent. It's a very positive cash flow effect for both parties. The last one is probably where a ton of people are going to land as well, and that's getting free base rent. Base rent is the piece that goes to the landlord to pay for their loans or whatever lender expenses they have to pay for their building when they purchased it. And then you're going to pay the triple net and the CAM. The triple net, I've got this detailed out later in our resources, but in case you're not familiar, that means that you're going to pay the real estate taxes, you're going to pay the insurance, and you're going to pay any maintenance of the place. That's typically how lease agreements are written now. And then the CAM is the common area maintenance, the snow removal, the lawn maintenance, the roofing repairs, whatever the common area maintenance is, maybe the administrative person that they allocate to their tenants. Paying triple net and CAM means that the landlord doesn't have to come out of their pocket to pay for these things. And that's a big concern for a landlord, is having to pay. They don't want to pay your real estate taxes. They don't want to pay your common area maintenance. They don't want to pay your insurance for your space. And so asking for free base rent and then offering to pay these things is a really great place to meet for a lot of folks and can save you a lot of money. I think this is where a lot of people are going to land, as this is clearly going to go, in my opinion, 60 or 90 days for closures. That's where we're going to land on a lot of these folks. And we may even be in a situation where we can pay the triple net and the CAM and then maybe get a free base rent once or twice. But if you can't get free base rent, getting the base rent deferred, but just paying the triple net and the common area maintenance. Obviously, we want to get everything in writing, and we want to make sure that we're preventing the potential of default. But getting it in writing, really, really is important. You could put your lease in default by not paying your full rent as agreed, as it's in the lease. And so it's really important we get it in writing. I spoke with 2 landlord agents, and they both agree that emails are sufficient at this time, as long as it's from an authorized representative and the terms are clearly written. You don't want an email that says, hey, we're good on that thing that we talked about. It's like, no, we agreed. We're not paying April rent. We're going to pick back up in May. And that includes the full amount of $12,354 or whatever your rent is. We want to make it really clear. The court of law will probably look at an email from a reasonable agent of the landlord and agree with that email. And if they can send you, or if they do send you an adjusted invoice that says, your adjusted invoice is here for triple net and the common area maintenance, that is going to be as good as gold. You won't be in default if they adjust their invoice. Last slide here. Thanks for hanging in there. I realize we're getting to that hour mark. Appreciate everybody investing the time and hope that you're getting value out of this and getting some ways that are going to help you with your landlord and your rent situation. Do not default. I'm begging each and every one of our fitness owners, do not default. Do not dodge your landlord. Do not bury your head in the sand. We have some really bad worst case scenarios by not paying rent. Easiest is, late fees. Okay, you pay a couple bucks. You could cure the default later. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it's not great. Bad will. This is tough. We don't want to build bad will with our landlords. We don't want to be in a situation where later when we need help, they're not going to be there for us. Suspicion that you're trying to get out of things, that you're trying to weasel through things. We don't need that from landlords either. If they're, concerned about receiving future month's rent, it could create a problem. And the most important thing for a lot of our fitness owners is a landlord is not going to be willing to renew. If you default on your lease, they're going to have a way to not renew that lease. And they're going to say, look, the terms that we agreed to for that renewal period, they're void. You defaulted on your lease and we're not going to allow you to renew. Or maybe they will allow you to renew, but they're going to pull back the favorable terms that were in your original lease. And they're going to say, sure, you can renew with us, but it's going to be $1,000 more per month because you defaulted, and they will have the legal right to do that. A little bit out of the scope of this, but we want to talk about future lease possibilities, future addendums to lease. And so, one of the things is possibly getting something included for that force majeure or specifically listed for a future pandemic. I don't know that they're going to be willing to do that, but that's a possibility when you get to a renewal period. And it's certainly a possibility whenever you're negotiating a new lease to make sure that those terms are included. The last one would be making sure that your lease has a pro rata share for common area maintenance and those triple net, the insurance and property taxes. Make sure that if your space is temporarily empty, but your co-tenants, if those spaces go empty, if they close, if they goes bankrupt, make sure that your landlord doesn't take advantage of you during a downturn. We want to make sure that, if that's not included, that we do get that into an addendum, that you're paying just your building's share of the insurance. So if another tenant goes away, that you don't absorb a proportionate share of their real estate taxes and their insurance. And so you can speak with your attorney, you can speak with one of your advisors to make sure that that pro rata share of common area maintenance and triple net is correctly listed in your lease. I want to do a special thanks to Megan Allen from Fran Promise, Greg Glass from Gibbons White, and Brandon Hall from the Real Estate CPA. Just couldn't do this without everybody's support. And I want to let all of you fitness professionals out there know that we're here to help. Please download our resources for the initial ask and the secondary ask transcript and written written request for initial abatement. We're here to support you through anything you need through both the COVID-19 challenges, and then afterwards, when we all rise up through this, if there's any way that we can support you through your accounting, financial, or government needs, please reach out. We'd love to help. Thank you. I hope you got value out of today's video, and take care.